I hope that your week has gone well so far. And for our Wednesday spotlight this week, I actually want to begin a series for the next several weeks to look at Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, and to look at Nehemiah's example and the people's example. We're going to look at several aspects of Nehemiah and his work for the Lord. And I look forward to this series with you. I think there's quite a bit we can learn from what went on in Nehemiah's day and what is recorded for us in the book of Nehemiah. And it all begins, as it always does, it begins with the heart. As in anything for God and for his purpose and cause for the work of the Lord, for living for God, it has to start in the heart. If it's not in our heart first, then we're not going to be motivated to do anything for God. And let's notice Nehemiah's heart. In Nehemiah chapter 1, we're going to look at the first couple chapters. We're really first chapter and then half of the second chapter. But starting here, just kind of setting the background. Remember that Nehemiah found himself in the days after the captivity, and there had been a return, and then now Nehemiah is going to find out the state of the people in Israel after they have returned. And that's what we see here in Nehemiah chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, beginning in verse 1, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. Okay, so Nehemiah says, all right, one day Hanani, one of the Jews, one of my brethren, came with others from Judah. Now Nehemiah, as we're going to find out, he's not in his homeland. He is technically still in captivity, working for the king as a cupbearer. It says, I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had returned from the captivity, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. So Nehemiah, here's Nehemiah, still in captivity, still serving this king, but his concern, his mind and his heart are about God's people and about the city of God, Jerusalem. And so he asks these men, saying, how is everybody? How is everything there in Jerusalem? And they said to me, verse 3, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. It wasn't good news. The people are still distressed. They're being reproached, and actually, we'll find out more. They're being oppressed by the enemies around them. The enemies had discouraged them even from rebuilding the temple for some time. But now, even if the temple's taken care of and done, now the walls of Jerusalem are still down, still broken, still destroyed. So Nehemiah, notice how he reacts. He doesn't just say, oh man, well, that's too bad. Well, I gotta go. I gotta get back to what I'm doing, my life here now. No, it says, verse 4, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. This hit Nehemiah hard because of Nehemiah's heart for God and for God's people. Nehemiah, to hear about God's people suffering and in distress and being reproached and the walls still not being rebuilt, that affected Nehemiah deeply. It upset him. It saddened him. He cried. He mourned for many days. He was fasting. He was praying. That's because of the care, the love, the care, the concern that he had for God and God's people in his heart. And notice his prayer to God in the rest of this chapter. In verse 5, I said, so Nehemiah says, I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations, which Nehemiah is acknowledging. That's what happened. We were unfaithful. You have punished us. We're in captivity. But also, the other part of God's covenant, that if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. What Nehemiah is praying about, and as we're about to see, is Nehemiah has heard the bad news about his people back home. The people have returned, and that's supposed to be great. They've started to return. There were 3 returns altogether. And this is supposed to be a good time and a great time and a time of rebuilding and restoration. But it's not really gone as well as it should have. And so Nehemiah is praying and acknowledging again, yes, we've sinned. Yes, you've punished us in captivity, but you've promised to return us. If we'll return to you, you've promised to return us and restore us. Please hear my prayer that he's saying that I can help in the restoration of your people, of your city, my people, my city. As we're going to see, his petition before the king, praying to God, Lord, please help me prosper this day. Grant me mercy in the sight of this man, the king. That the king will allow Nehemiah to help get things done for God and God's people, as we see in the next chapter. Continuing in chapter 2, it goes on to say, it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, so here we see Nehemiah he's sad, he's emotional. And the king can tell it. So the king says, why is your face sad since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid. I mean, maybe he's worried, like the king, I don't know what he's going to think about me being sad. Then I don't know what the king's going to think about what I'm wanting to do. So he said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? So he tells the king. He tells the king what's going on. The king says, what's the matter? Nehemiah's kind of nervous to tell him, but he tells him and said, well, I'm sad because my people, the city of my fathers, is lying waste. The gates are burned with fire. Well, then the king actually says to Nehemiah, what do you request? So he responds, well, kind of interested. Well, what are you wanting to do? Notice what Nehemiah does. Something that emphasized what Nehemiah often did. It says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. He's in the middle of this conversation with the king. He's already prayed to God before, give me success, mercy in the sight of the king. Now he's starting to have this conversation with the king, and now the king asks, what do you request? And so Nehemiah prays again. I believe probably the same thing. Lord, here it goes. Please help the king to listen, to accept, and to help me get done what I want to get done. So it says, I pray to the God of heaven. And then I said to the king, verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. That's his request. That's his desire. This is more than just him wanting to get out of work for the king or him wanting to even go back home or whatever. He is concerned. His heart is determined to help God's people. And the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. And look what happens. The king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. God did it. And Nehemiah praises and thanks and gives credit to God for the king accepting and agreeing and helping with this. Then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. But when Sanballat and the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Now, we'll get to them later. They're going to come up much later. These guys don't like it too much that God's people, that the Jews, the children of Israel are possibly building up and getting stronger again. But we'll come back to that another time. So I came to Jerusalem and was there for 3 days, he says there in verse 11. Nehemiah got to go. But again, all of this started in Nehemiah's heart. When Nehemiah heard and found out about the condition of God's people in God's city, Nehemiah was upset. It affected him, and he wanted to do something about it. He didn't just shrug it off or say, oh man, that's a bummer. Well, I'm too busy and no, I this. Or, Nehemiah didn't even make excuses of why he couldn't do it. Well, the king won't let me go and, I've got to work here and, whatever. And no, Nehemiah, his heart was touched by the needs for God's people and God's city. Therefore, for God. And helping God in the work for his people. Nehemiah decided to take action, to take charge, to become a leader, to get work done. So it started in his heart, but then notice what he did. Then he went to God in prayer about it. It started in his heart, he prayed about it, then he acted. By asking the king, getting the king's approval and the necessary materials, and then traveling to Jerusalem. And all of that was blessed by God. Nehemiah, it started in his heart. He prayed about it, then he acted. What I learned from this, and I hope will encourage you as well, is when we talk about living for God, and we talk about his church, his people, his kingdom, when we talk about the work of the kingdom, and sharing the gospel, living the gospel, worshiping God, growing, all of these things, it's got to start in our heart. Because if it's not in our heart first, then we're not going to do anything, and or we're just going to go through the motions even if we do. Where's our heart? Is our heart in it? Is our heart sincerely, truly touched and concerned with love for God and love for God's people? And love for lost souls? It's got to start in us, in our hearts. And then we need to pray about it. And pray for God's help and guidance and blessings. And then we got to act. It can't stay in our hearts. We can't just pray about it. We've then got to act. With God's help and guidance and with prayer, we've got to act and get busy for the Lord. And that's what we'll see next time especially. But it's got to start in the heart. It started in the heart of Nehemiah. And it's got to start in our heart as well. Let's work on that. today, tomorrow, next week, next year, right now, as long as we have today, we have time. Let's love God with all of our heart and love others as ourselves and have a heart that is concerned about God's people, concerned about lost souls, needing salvation in Jesus. Let's have a heart for God and His work. God bless.